争いの匂いというのはかくも懐
Oh,
かしい。
the rank. Oh, who's that?
Can he stall Dumbo?
What does this skill do?
私を
Oh, he binds them.
せろ。
And
Look at him go.
it's what?
He's finally here. After years of being clowned on because of how hard he got power crept. First by a 5-star wolf girl that cheated her way to the top by getting a 6-star altar version, followed by a 2-star using the same underhanded tactic. But Hypergriff decided it was enough, and using the same altar method made him one of the strongest characters in the game. Tragodia, that competes even with other busted ops like Axial Altar or Wizardel, on top of having some of the coolest visual effects in the game with the purple color palette for all his attacks and explosions. It's just a shame that some of you might have to see that on low res if you play on mobile. Even some emulators have performance issues with it and start stuttering here and there whenever you use his skills. Which is why I'm glad to bring a solution to that, MuMuPlayer. If you never used Mumu before, then you really should consider doing it. Creating an emulator instance on it is as easy as clicking 2 buttons, and after you're done it's just as easy to customize it for your own needs. As you can see, it takes me just a few more clicks to get it running at a 4K resolution and stable 60 FPS. I was also surprised to find that after downloading Arknights on Mumu and starting the game, it already had all the keybinds I normally use set up and fully customizable in case I wanted to change anything. So I had the smoothest transition period possible with the closest version of a PC client you can have now. But the best part of it all is that everything you just saw was completely ad-free. I didn't have to deal with any AI slop or ads of questionable nature while using it. Just start it up and play Arknights. So if you want a complete ad-free experience while also having the highest possible performance and resolution, then make sure to download MuMuPlayer with my exclusive link. It's in both a pinned comment and the description. I'm very grateful to MuMuPlayer for sponsoring this video, and don't worry, I know you're here for Tragodia. So let's analyze his kit to show why he's so broken, starting with S1. This is the simplest skill in his kit, which follows the same pattern as most modern 6-stars, whose S1s are generally good AFK skills that introduce their kits. What it does is deal 2 hits of arts damage equal to 150% of his attack, and bind the target for 1.5 seconds. It also makes so bound mobs take 1.8 times nervous impairment damage and prioritizes mobs not under the burst effect. Like I said, simple but it introduces the main mechanic of his kit, nervous impairment. Like burn or necrosis, is another type of elemental damage, and the strongest out of the 3 for being honest. Not because it does the most damage, it actually does the least amount per proc as you can see on screen, but rather for the insane level of utility it has, since each nervous impairment proc also applies 3 stacks of paralysis. That's the name of the debuff mobs get when they have this lightning icon above their heads. It has a cap of 3, so every proc already hits the limit, and whenever a mob with this debuff uses a normal attack, it will consume 1 stack to negate that same attack. You can also keep track of how many stacks it has left by seeing how full the icon is.
That just sounds like frightening extra steps. How is it any better than using Dagenbrecher?
Well, because of what you'll see now. Frighten is very inconsistent, there's currently no good way of applying it for a long period of time without RNG, but as long as you keep proccing nervous impairment, the enemy will remain perma-locked without being able to attack, and Tragodia is the perfect op when it comes to consistent procs because of his archetype. He's a ritualist, the same as Virtuosa, that means he gets the privilege of being able to apply his elemental damage without needing to worry about res, which is usually a big barrier for ops outside his archetype, with the only defensive stat that's able to stop them being used only once in the history of the game on Chapter 15, and it was extremely effective at stopping them, as you can see on screen right now. But even with the same archetype, they both function very differently, and we can already see that reflected on Tragodia's Talent 1. What it does is make so his attacks inflict nervous impairment, which is completely different from how Virtuosa does it, with her just applying it to every mob in her range indiscriminately. At first it might look like her way of doing it's just better, since she can just apply necrosis without a care for anything other than if there's someone in her range or not, while Tragodia can only focus his attacks on one area at a time, so when there are a lot of enemies he can get overwhelmed, but it's not that cut and dry. Yes, he can only apply apply his nervous impairment when attacking, but to compensate for that he also does it much faster since his balance multiplier is a lot higher, while also being able to splash a portion of it to mobs around the main target. That way Tragodia is still able to hit multiple targets per attack if they're close to each other. And this really highlights how these elemental damage types differ. Necrosis is a lot more damage focused. Virtuosa still has some utility in her kit, but the main focus of it is still applying and amplifying Necrosis damage, so it is better to do it indiscriminately to as many mobs as you can reach. While Nervous Impairment is a lot more utility focused, which is heavily emphasized inside Tragodia's kit, so it ends up being worth it to trade some AoE coverage for better application inside specific areas, which is basically what S1 emphasizes. It gives him one extra hit, that doubles how much he applies, as well as more attack when it's active, which also benefits his application since that's reliant on his attack, so he is able to proc it very quickly to keep refreshing the 3 paralysis stacks. The skill is also offensive recovery, so he needs to have a target in range to charge it, but they made it only cost 2 SP at M3, so it ends up being a non-issue. And on top of that, S1 also has the 1.5 second bind on the main target. It really shows what this skill and consequently his kit focuses on, crowd control and elemental damage. And in terms of introducing his kit, S1 does a decent job, but like I said, it just can't compete with the other two. Even if you're lazy, those are just so much stronger than S1 that even if they aren't AFK, it would still be easier to use them. It has a few niche things you can do, like increase his attack speed so he charges S1 faster, that way you can permabind one mob in place, but the cost you maintain that is very high on normal stages, so unless you're playing something like IS or SSS where it's extremely easy to stack a lot of attack speed, it ends up not being worth doing it a lot of times. They've made some mobs that need a bit more stalling recently though, so maybe you can find a few uses for it out there. All in all, this is a decent skill and a fun introduction to his kit.
憎悪が君の代わりに語る
Amber, stop being good!
歌声に抗う必要はない
Is an Amber showcase now?
Can he do it?
Maybe.
Oh.
Okay. Oh.
Try.
Do it again. There we
Got
go.
this.
We got this.
There you go.
Yeah, see. You just
It's now that things start getting interesting, because this is when we talk about S2.
狙撃近く武装解除確認
This is Tragodia's overall best skill for most situations, and it really expands on S1's role. What it does is give him 35 attack speed, increase talent 1's splash range, and gives Tragodia a deployable cat that attracts up to 4 enemies in his range when dropped and explodes, dealing 150% of his attack as arts damage, 25% as numbers impairment, as well as slowing every mob in range down when they reach him. Pretty worthy, but overall the skill itself is quite simple. First you have these buffs at the start of S2, more attack speed and increased splash area. Since S2 is an infinite duration skill, Tragodia will get them permanently once it charges, and it's quite evident how good extra attack speed is for him since it helps proc nervous impairment more frequently. The increase in splash area is also quite nice to hit more mobs, but as you can probably guess from how enthusiastically I'm talking about it, these buffs aren't that crazy. They do help his own elemental damage application, so they're far from useless, but you should treat them as more of a bonus that complements the main part. Literally a cat. This is what 95% of the skill stacks is dedicated to, which is honestly justified given how strong this thing is. The cat is a deployable that Tragodia gets once S2 is charged. Once you have it, it can be dropped on any deployable melee tile, and after it does its thing, it will simply go back to the bench with a 25-second cooldown. So you can use it as many times as you want once S2 is charged, and you really want to spam this cat as much as possible because of how broken the effects are. The first and most important one is that it will attack up to 4 mobs in range, which will be marked by this eye icon above their head for 10 seconds. It also prioritizes elites and bosses, so when you're in situations with a lot of trash mobs like the one you see on screen right now, it will affect the actual stronger threats instead of being baited by weaker enemies. This effect alone already lets you do some pretty busted stuff, like abusing map design to effectively perma-stall lower mobs by making them walk back and forth. And even in situations where that's not possible, maybe due to the stage not having a good layout for that, it can still serve as a very strong crowd control effect that can slow down some problematic waves of elites, which might actually save your run in a lot of situations, especially since you can keep throwing the cat back into the field once the cooldown ends, so even if it's just by a small bit every time, Tragodia can still keep enemies from reaching the blue box. And all that is made even easier with the other effects of this cat, some of which you probably noticed on the footage at this point. One of them is that when any enemy gets too close to it, this cat will explode and inflict an 80% slow to every mob in range for 6 seconds, as well as 12 hits that deal both arts damage and 25% of Tragodia's attack as nervous impairment. This slow makes the crowd control even stronger. The fact that it's also as high as 80% is honestly baffling considering how good the attack already is, and him also applying elemental damage to every enemy in range just makes this even more broken. But remember, nervous impairment isn't mainly about damage. You can just drop the cat and it will hurt enemies quite a lot since it is still elemental damage, but especially on modern stages, most elites can live through it easily. And this is where the paralysis comes. Even when the damage isn't enough to kill an enemy, the fact that mobs will be locked out of 3 normal attacks, on top of needing to run back, on top of getting an 80% slow for 6 seconds, all these things buy time for the cat to cycle back, so you can still lock enemies in the stalled cycle of running back where they came from, getting slowed down by the explosion, be forced to waste 3 normal attacks on whatever op you have deployed, just to start the cycle again. And I've only been talking about his crowd control up until now, but this is enemy displacement, one of the most versatile effects in the game. You can't just use it to stop mobs from getting to the blue box, but you can also make a bunch of them gather around one place so they all get hit by AoE attacks, catch enemies that manage to sleep through your ops. There are a bunch of different ways to use this cat, and you do have a lot of freedom here with how much QL they gave him. For starters, the cat range is very good, so you can affect a huge area with each deployment. Then you have the fact that even if you can only attract 4 enemies, the explosion itself will hit every enemy inside the cat's range. You also don't need to wait for an enemy to reach it for it to proc. If you just retreat the cat, the explosion will still go off. This is good for anyone to damage mobs that can't move, or simply hit enemies passing through as fast as possible, since not every enemy inside the range runs towards it. They also decided to make it affect aerial enemies, cause why not? But honestly, the biggest QL they gave this cat is that the redeploy cooldown starts not when it leaves the field, but when you deploy it. Which is not how ops with deployables usually work. This is actually something he takes from OG Phantom, since this is exactly how his clone works. The benefit of it is that now you don't need to worry about retreating the cat early just to get it back faster. You can simply let enemies walk into it and use the retreats just for the kills I already mentioned. This is what makes a lot of the permastall setups possible, since depending on the map layouts, all the time they lose walking up to the cat is time it's saving on cooldown. This creature has quite literally everything going for it. Even Talon 2 manages to benefit it in some way. What it does is make enemies under nervous impairment have minus 12 attack speed, as well as inflict 70 nervous impairments to mob that attack in his range. Overall, this sound isn't anything that crazy. It basically just makes enemies take a bit of elemental injury per attack. But since it takes 1000 and 2000 on normal enemies and bosses respectively for it to actually proc an elemental burst, this 70 per hit ends up being a nice boost to Tragodia's application. And the same is true for the attack speed debuff. Minus 12 attack speed is just a 12% reduction, which in most cases won't make that much of an impact. But since the cat's cooldown is already so short, even delaying a mob for an extra 1 or 2 seconds can make a difference sometimes. So it ends up helping us too, while also alleviating one of Nervous Impairment's weaknesses. And given how much I glazed this elemental damage up until now, you might be shocked in hearing it even has one. But the game still needs to be able to counter it somehow. So it does have a few, and the first one is what you see now. Like I said, most of the strength in Nervous Impairments comes from the 3 stacks of paralysis it inflicts, but like every elemental burst, Nervous Impairments also has a cooldown between each proc, and during that period you just can't refresh the stacks. So if an enemy is able to attack fast enough, they can break free from a Tragodia stall. And the enemies attacking too fast also affects the cat stalls, since in a lot of cases that relies on the paralysis to buy time. Now, the example you're seeing on screen is very extreme. No boss even comes close to being as aggressive as this bear, so you are unlikely to run into a scenario like that. But it is a way to counter him if Hypergriff wants to. Another weakness the cat has is that, as you can see right now, the attract only works if the mob is reachable. Reachable means they must be able to walk up to it directly, without needing to enter a staircase, even if they are inside his range. In one of the examples we just saw, for instance, it's impossible for a ground mob to reach the cat, so they aren't attracted. Then when I remove one box, a route opens up and they finally move. This doesn't affect our enemies funnily enough, since they can always go anywhere they want on the field. And most importantly, this only applies to the attract portion, so it is still possible to damage mobs even when they aren't reachable. I think it's pretty clear by now how broken this S2 is. Even all these weaknesses I mentioned aren't that big of a deal. Most of them are there just to ensure Tragodia doesn't completely break the game. And even then you still have simple workarounds for a lot of them. So unless they design a map specifically to counter him, you can play around with basically anything they throw at you. They quite literally had to make Pay 13 immune to it on the CC version of 7-18 to stop S2. This is an extremely versatile and powerful crowd control option that allows him to affect the entirety of the field even when he himself can't reach certain places. With this cat you can make a spectacle out of most enemies, and unless they tailor an environment to specifically counter it, just will still perform really well even inside and in-game content. You can actually think of the cat as one of the fast redeploys ops. In fact, in a lot of cases it will straight up just outperform them, especially when there are strong enemies where you want them deployed. This is Tragodia's best overall skill and the highest priority one to level up if you manage to get him. Can he do it now, Dambo?
Probably. Wait, are we just doing the same? We're just doing the same stage over and over.
No. He's got this now, okay? Oh!
Is he?
Oh!
It seems. Was he summoning small cats? What? That was kind of useless.
Lastly, then we have S3.
舞台に上がろうとさえ体を乗せる
I've already said many times that Tragodia's best role is crowd control, and S3 is the skill for this one specific purpose. S2 is still the overall best for how versatile it is, but if we're talking purely about stalling, then S3 takes the crown. What it does is increase his range, gives plus 125% attack, attacks prioritize enemies not on elemental burst state, makes mobs attacked by him take 10% of his attack as nervous impairment until it ends, reduces elemental cooldown of mobs in range by 50%, and whenever an enemy in range triggers any nervous impairment burst, Tragodia will summon a cage on their position to lock them in place. Again, a bunch of words for a skill that's very simple to understand, because quite literally more than half of it is basically applying nervous impairments better. First you have the range expansion. As you can see, it's the Virtuoso S3 range, so he already has a very good area coverage in here. Although for S3 that might be bad in a few cases if you have too many mobs that are too spread out, because the more mobs you have scattered around, the harder it is for him to focus his attacks on the ones you want. And if you're using S3, that's a very important thing to maintain. But now we need to talk about S3's most important asset, the cages. So what are these anyway? Well, when a mob receives nervous impairment burst inside Tragodia's range while S3 is up, he will summon this cage on the same tile they're positioned at. The cage is basically a summon whose only purpose is block mobs, and as you can see on screen it doesn't have HP, but instead it takes 3 hits to be destroyed, which synergizes perfectly with an op whose main gimmick is stopping attacks.
But what's the benefit of using this? Can't I just choose another op to block who I want and have the same effect?
Well, leaving aside the fact that this effect is already inside the skill, so it doesn't waste squad slots or any other resources if you just use it, yes. In fact, there are many reasons why these cages are broken. The first is that S3 is just his best skill for a fast elemental proc, since it both gives him a huge attack buff and a nervous impairment dot, on top of accelerating enemies' elemental cooldown period. Yes, remember that weakness I talked about where he can't refresh paralysis while mobs are recovering from a proc? Which can lead to a stall failing. Well, S3 alleviates that a lot by making them recover faster, so Tragodia can proc it a lot more frequently to refresh the stacks. But even outside S3's application, the cage itself is busted because of how straight up bends the rules. If we go back to the stats, you can see that this thing only has one block, which is pretty mediocre for something that's used for stalling, and will lose to a defender if you have more than one mob, but this isn't the entire story. Look at what happens when you have multiple enemies on one tile.
逃げる前に私の許可は取ったのかしらねえ獲物さん
舞台に上がる二つ体を持って
The cages will always have the necessary block count to stop every mob on that tile they spawn at. You can even see the different block counts on their stat screens. They'll even adapt to mob that needs more than one block, and there's still more. Tragodia can spawn them on undeployable tiles as well as red and blue boxes, places where you normally wouldn't be able to block things. He can even cage aerial enemies, as long as something has a block count they can be affected by S3. And when the skill ends, the cages don't go away, they'll stay on field until they're either destroyed or Tragodia's retreated. But getting rid of them might take a while because of the paralysis, which will only buy more time for him to charge it back up and have a huge chunk of it back when they're finally gone. It gets even better when you add other ops to help during downtime too, which is basically what you see on screen now. On CC before, one of his roles was stalling the last wave that was spread between two different lanes and composed by mobs that explode when they die. Here his range came into play to keep him out of the explosion's range while locking down both lanes during the S3's uptime. Then when it finally ended, you had Lazy S1 spamming Disarm to keep the cages from being destroyed until Tragodia cycled back, creating basically permastall. And then we get to his module, which I'm already gonna tell you is not that impressive effect-wise. What it does is increase the elemental injury dealt to elites and bosses by 18%. That's what the damage you deal to the circular bar is called. It also increases Talent 2's attack speed debuff as well as the nervous impairment damage enemies take when attacking. Overall, these are nice effects to have, but they aren't that massive compared to some other modules.
I see, so I can just skip this one to not waste resources.
No. In fact, I recommend you get this module to level 3 and Tragodia himself to it to level 82 because of what you see now. Remember how I said nervous impairment is tied to his attack? Well, that also means if he doesn't have enough attack, he can't proc it. If Phantom is just attacking a mob, then he can usually not care about that because it's just gonna be 1 or 2 extra hits. But if you're using S2, his best skill, then a lot of times he won't be in range, and all the elemental injury mobs receive will come purely from the cat. If you're attacking elites and normal mobs, then that will be more than enough, but bosses need double the amount of elemental injury. And if your Tragodia doesn't have at least 565 attack, with the module upgrade, then 1 cat's just not enough. So the module becomes mandatory to reach S2's full potential. And at part 1 you'll also need him level 82 to have enough attack. Which brings us to S3's weaknesses. The first has to do with his accelerated recovery. Even when you account for that, S3 still has cooldown between procs, so it is possible for mobs to break free from it. Again, this bear is special. I don't think you're gonna see other mobs like him anytime soon. Something we might see though is multi-hit attacks, and that's a problem because of what you see now. See, nervous impairment works by cancelling attacks. It doesn't matter if someone like Pedro can deal multiple hits per attack, each paralysis attack will cancel every hit since they all come from the same attack. But the cages work based on hits, so it is possible for them to be one-shot if a mob has multi-hit attacks. Another thing is unblockable mobs. Like I said, Tragodia can cage even narrow enemies as long as they have a block count. But if they are unblockable like Minimalist here, then S3 will have no effect on them. These are always hyper-glyph can count on S3, but honestly the biggest weakness here is literally a cat. S2 is just so strong that it overshadows S3 most of the time, especially if you're in the majority of the player base that doesn't care about CC and other endgame stuff. And even in those kinds of game modes, S2 can still outperform S3. So unless you have the right environment, which most players just don't engage with, then 9 times out of 10 S2 will be better for most people. Which is why I don't think it will hurt to skip it if you're low on mats and don't really care about tryharding. Overall, Tragodia is a phenomenal character meta-wise. He introduces a level of crowd control you never had before. Even ops like an Info are still somewhat limited by requiring setup. Now not only that setup is a lot more flexible for Tragodia, but he's an even even restricted by range. His influence reaches the entirety of the field with that cat, while having no cost for all that coverage, and it isn't even restricted to only stalling. Like I said, you can just treat it as a Yato or Texas Altar if you want. On top of that, you also have S3 to shut down enemies in an area and prevent them from doing anything while it lasts, which is more niche than S2, but it also has proven how valuable it can be. All this makes him a must pull if you care about meta, and you certainly won't be disappointed by his performance, even when you take other future ops into account, or even the busted ones we just got. But that's the subject of another video, one you should go watch if you're interested. Just make sure to leave a like and subscribe before you go. Also comment what you think of Tragodia. And if you want to support me, get a channel badges, emote to my comments, get early access to videos like this, or even appear in a Blunner special place, you can also consider becoming a member. I also think you're really cool if you do that.
私は体を持ってる
That's it then. Bye.
幕引きにはまだ早い。